Well, good evening, everybody. If you are joining us, this is the Ruminant Revival webinar for GB Calf Week. So it's great to have you all along. I'm going to just give everybody a couple of minutes to get online and get set up ready. But if you're joining us, we'd love to hear about who you are and where you're from. You can pop that into the chat function, which is on the bottom of your screen. Just say who you are, where you're from, where you're joining from, if you want to. It would be lovely to know that. I'm just going to give everybody a minute or two to join us. Welcome, everyone. And while we're going through the webinar, if folk have things that they want to share, useful tips or information, then please do feel free to do that in the chat function. This is also about people being able to share their own stories and information, as well as us all hearing from Colin Mason, of course. Okay, so we've got a fair few people joined us now. As I say, if you feel that you would like to, then please do say who you are and where you're from in the chat. We would love to know a bit about you. Great. Okay. Well, welcome everybody. This is a webinar for GB Calf Week with Colin Mason. My name's Emma Thwaites and I work with Colin and the team at Ruminant Revival. Before we start tonight's webinar, I'd just like to go through a bit of housekeeping for how things are going to go. So during the talk, Colin's talk, if you have any questions, if you could add those into the chat, that would be brilliant. And we will aim to get through as many questions as we can after Colin finishes his talk. You might have noticed the webinar is being recorded, so we'll be posting it after the fact on the Ruminant Revival YouTube channel and also using parts of it on our website and social media. And our social media is LinkedIn. That's where we have our social media. So please, if you're on LinkedIn, follow us there. Or if you're interested in finding out more about Ruminant Revival, then sign up for our newsletter. You can do that on the website. So on with the order of the day. Our topic today is around what Colin has called the forgotten window, and that's that critical time between weaning and transitioning. And Colin's going to be talking to us about why managing this time sustainably is so important and giving us some practical insights into managing the diet transition from milk to solid feed, among many other things. So first, and very briefly, to introduce Ruminant Revival and Colin himself. So Ruminant Revival is the UK's first vet-led consultancy dedicated to helping food producers keep their animals healthy and build adaptable, productive farms, while also reducing reliance on chemicals and pharmaceuticals. Colin Mason is a vet consultant with Ruminant Revival. An Edinburgh graduate, he has 30 years of farm and animal veterinary experience, including more than 20 years at SRUC across dairy, beef and sheep in Ayrshire and Dumfries and Galloway. At Ruminant Revival, he takes an evidence-based proactive approach to disease, looking behind the presenting problem to the animal, environmental and nutritional risk factors that allow high-performing animals to stay healthy and productive. Now, everyone, don't forget to pop your questions into the chat function as Colin goes through his talk. But for now, Colin, it's over to you.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Thank you very much for giving up a little bit of your time this evening to listen to this webinar as part of GB Calf Week. And what we wanted to do was focus on an area which is really critical to how our calves develop once they've got through the milk feeding phase and as they develop on to being fully adult ruminants, how they go on and grow, and how we can hopefully keep them healthy through what is a major transition in their lives, quite early in their lives, if we compare when we wean dairy calves to when we might wean beef suckle calves, for example. So we want to take them through this transition as simply and as effectively as possible. And that's what I want to focus on in my talk for the next maybe 25 minutes or so. Also, in a window like this, we could talk on this subject for hours. There is an awful lot that is written about it, and I want to just highlight some of the main points that I think are relevant, and also some of the practical take-home messages as well. So what I am aiming to cover in the next few minutes is some growth targets and some opportunities and how they fit into really the bigger picture of calf rearing and age at first calving. I want to talk about the diet transition and preparing the calves rumen for the future. Also transitioning calves to grass for block calving herds that maybe are calving in the spring. Some of the key and the emerging health challenges, and in particular, they're managing respiratory health risks. And I was going through the talk at the end, and I think I've got 8 take-home conclusions at the end that you might want to take from this, or at least if you take 1 or 2 of those, then that would be good. So really, by way of context to start off with, I wanted to talk about just the general growth targets. And this is a screenshot from a spreadsheet that is the NASEM guidelines from 2021 on what we would expect a heifer to do from birth to first calving and then on into first and then second lactation. So first of all, it's a spreadsheet. We can put whatever figures we like into this, and this is just one example, but it does give some key pointers as to where we need to be going with these animals in terms of how we need them to grow. And I think the first point that I would like to make is actually knowing what our end destination is in all of this. We can change this number as appropriate, depending on the cows, the cow type, the cow size, but what is our end weight for the animals at mature weight? And the reason for just maybe emphasizing this one is that I think we as vets and sometimes as producers do slightly underestimate the weight of some of our cows, in that if we've got an average weight of a Holstein of 700 to 750 kilos, there are some of these girls that are way more than that, could easily be approaching a ton. And it's just having a realistic estimation of where we are with mature cow weight, which then feeds back to where we want to be in terms of our growth rates, and particularly the figure of somewhere between 55 and 60% of mature body weight at conception is where we want them to be in terms of that initial growth from birth to 12 to 15 months old. So quite critical that we know what our end point is in all of this. Clearly, one of the big drivers on herd efficiency, be that financial sustainability or carbon sustainability, is age at first calving, and those figures feed directly into that. This is some data that's lifted from the annual KPI survey of the UK national dairy herd that's produced every year by the University of Reading team. I've lifted a couple of these graphs from their report that was released in March of this year, and it shows where we are in the UK dairy herd for a sample of 500 NMR milk recording dairy herds. And it shows that clearly our age at first calving is reducing, and the graph on the left, and we've made significant progress in this between 2010 and 2025 when this data was up until, but we're still sitting for our best performing herds at around about 25 months as our age at first calving. And age at first calving does also have a direct correlation with what our productive life is for these cows, and which we're trying to have as long and as healthy a productive life as possible. And the graph on the right does show changes in productive life over time, and the blue line in the middle of that is the average for this group of 500 herds, or rather the median for this group of 500 herds, which is sitting at just 3.5 years of productive life, which is between first calving and the end of their functional life or the productive life. So there is some scope for improvement there, although I also do take the point entirely that some of these figures around productive life relate to cow price, genetic gain, cull price, etc., etc. But we have some scope there for sure. You might have seen these figures before. These, I think, originated from Alex Bach originally, and are looking at some other targets for how we manage our heifers. And the first one is rearing efficiency, which is the percentage of heifers that are born alive, heifer calves that are born alive, that calve at or below the target of age at first calving. So if we set that target at 24 months, for example, 2 years, then we want more than 85% of our heifer calves born to have their first calve at or below 24 months. And 85% is a target that I would imagine a lot of dairy herds hit reasonably well. But the target below, which is the more challenging one, is what was termed heifer effectiveness, which is the percentage of heifers born alive that calve at or below the target age at first calving, the rearing efficiency, and then go on to complete 3 lactations. And well, targets are only what we set them as, but the target that was suggested was 75%, which I think is a really challenging target. But there is no question that whichever target we set there, and however our herds are performing, the number of heifers that make it into second and third lactation to become economically sustainable and also to lead healthy and productive lives is a key measure for how our herds are performing, and how we manage these girls at weaning directly impacts on that. So I was just thinking through major life events for calves that occur within a very, very short window of really 10 to 12 weeks. And there are a lot of them. And I'll come back to this slide later on as well. But maybe isn't an exhaustive list even, but it's the ones that I came up with. But, first of all, we've got being born and that adaptation to day one, getting used to life in the big bad world. They've got to learn to feed in whatever way we present the food to them, whether that's in buckets or machines, on buckets with teats. We move them around, whether that is from individual pens into group pens. We transport them if it's a dairy beef animal. We handle them to vaccinate them, which is, yes, to their benefit, but is also a source of stress to them whilst it's done. We may carry out castration, disbudding, which is a stressor when it occurs and when we time it. And there are obviously ways of minimizing that. There is the potential for illness and the associated handlings that go with that for treatment, which are a massive stress on a calf, and a fair bit of that occurs in the first 8 weeks of life. We've got diet changes, which is what we're going to focus on. We've got weather changes and the potential for either cold stress or recently heat stress. And then we've got weaning as one of the major life events that occurs somewhere between 8 and 16 weeks, depending on system. So quite a lot of stresses that a calf has to cope with, and we are dealing with baby animals at the end of the day that have to put up with quite a bit. So most of my talk that I'm going to go on to present on is talking about how we manage the animal to reduce the stresses and to maximize that calf's resilience as much as we possibly can. So I'm going to focus on the start about some of the changes that need to take place around weaning in terms of developing the rumen and transitioning that calf away from what is essentially a liquid diet into a solid diet. And I would reiterate again and come back to the fact that, if you're a beef suckler calf, this will be occurring at 6 months old over a very gradual period, and we're really streamlining and fast forwarding that in our dairy calves. But the baby calf on a high milk diet at 3 weeks old, the rumen volume is tiny, small. It's about a quarter total of the volume of the stomachs, and the abomasum is the true stomach and is the highest volume at 70+% of volume there. And that changes from the calf to a post-weaned full ruminant, where the rumen will take up somewhere about 70+% of total stomach volumes. 15% of that will be the abomasum, so that will shrink down in size, in relative size, and then the reticulum omasum, the second and third stomachs, will take about another 15% of the overall volume. So there's a huge change in structure, first of all, which is important to point out. And then there is a huge amount of development that needs to go on in the actual rumen itself to get that fully functioning. So if we take that right the way back to a young calf at, let's say, 2 or 3 weeks old, there is a population of microbes in the rumen already. There are bacteria, there are protozoa, there are fungi already existing in a calf rumen. And what we're aiming to do by supplying some solid food to that rumen is to trigger those bacteria that are there to produce volatile fatty acids. They will start to ferment the food material that we present to them. And that works in 2 ways. The more VFAs, volatile fatty acids, that are produced, the more that then goes on to supply energy to develop more rumen microbes, and that rumen microbiome starts to develop in a bigger way. As we produce more VFAs, then that is the trigger for the development of rumen papillae, and it is those rumen papillae, those finger-like projections that form on the mucosal surface of the rumen, that absorb these fatty acids and basically absorb the products of that fermentation to fuel the animal going forward. So it's the fatty acids, the VFAs, that develop rumen papillae and drive that development. And then the other thing that has to happen is that rumen muscle starts to need to contract, in that the adult ruminant will have rumen contractions, both for moving the material around in the rumen, and then also contractions to allow eructation and to allow cutting as well. So that muscular vessel that is the rumen has to develop the nervous function to fully contract in that way. So there's quite a lot of change that has to happen, and that has to start early and get going early. And the pictures you can see on the right hand of the screen, which I've will absolutely credit AHDB with, I've lifted that from their calf guide and their calf manual, and these are the linings of a calf's rumen. And the picture at the top is a calf's rumen where it's a milk-fed diet only, nice and smooth and very little absorptive capacity. The picture in the middle is a calf that is a milk-fed calf with some roughage going into it. And you can see there is some development to the rumen lining, but not very much. And the bottom one is where that calf is also receiving a calf starter, providing energy by way of carbohydrates to that rumen environment, and that is what really drives the obvious thickening of the rumen wall that you can see, which is the formation of papillae, whereby they can actually absorb the nutrients through the rumen wall. So you can see that's how that goes, and it's sometimes a common misconception. I think people think that it's fibre sometimes that drives that development, and it's not. It's the carbohydrate component, and particularly propionic and butyric acid, volatile fatty acids, that drive that. So diet has a big part to play in how that rumen develops, and you can see the same schematic that I've got along the top of this slide, where we just want to develop the microbiome, we want to develop production of volatile fatty acids, we want to develop rumen papillae, and we want to develop muscular contractions. And at some point, we need to stick some solid food in front of these calves to start that whole process and get that going. The other thing, modern dairy feeding systems, and it's not my place to talk about this tonight, and others will have talked about this as part of GB Calf Week, but in general, and I think this is a great thing, we're feeding higher levels of milk to our pre-weaned dairy calves, and in general feeding that for longer as well. And one of the kickbacks from that potentially is that solid food intake will be slower to build as a result of that. But we can get around that, and I'll come to that in a second. One of the figures that's talked about, and it's a particular metric that's used in the States, is the level of non-fiber carbohydrates. So that's the carbohydrates that are coming from, for example, starch material, pectins rather than fibre, plant fibre. So the non-fibre carbohydrate level, once a calf gets to 15 kilos total NFC, then that calf is ready to wean. And that is an interesting figure. It's maybe a slightly abstract figure as well in terms of how we know when that is and when that occurs. And a lot will depend on how much milk the calf takes, but also how much we feed it, and in particular how much starch we feed it, because starch actually will drive that NFC figure to 15 kilos. The more we feed, the quicker they get to that point and the quicker they are to wean. One of the risks of that, and I'll come on to this in a second, is that the higher levels of starch that we feed, the higher the acidosis risk. And that applies to any ruminant. And there are trends, certainly over the pond in the States, to feed quite high starch levels in starter feeds. They're usually around the 20% mark in the UK. But whichever way we cut it, we can increase the starch levels up to a point. But one of the key things that we need to do is that we need to make concentrate hard starter feed available to the calf from day one. And when that calf is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever days old, it's not going to be eating very much of that starter feed. It's majority of its diet and the majority of the food conversion efficiency that comes from it is going to be coming from milk. But we need to get that calf sticking its nose in a bucket of calf starter feed, having a little chew, having a little play with it, and learning what it is, because feeding is a learned behavior. They need to learn to eat. And even if they're eating very, very small amounts of concentrate at that stage, it is starting as soon as we can that process of developing the rumen in hand with feeding higher levels of milk as well. In order for that to happen, this is pure practicalities. We need to attract that calf to do it, and that feed needs to be something that that calf is interested in. It needs to be fresh, it needs to be palatable, it needs to be fed in small amounts to start off with and change daily, so that that calf is always thinking, I want to maybe try a bit of that, and it gets a taste for it. If it's wet and soggy because it's been rained on, or if it's covered in saliva from the day before, it's not going to be attractive. So as stock people, we need to work quite hard at making sure that that feed is attractive to them. The other thing that absolutely goes hand in hand with this, and it goes without saying in the hot spell of weather that we're experiencing as well, is that water needs to be available from day one to calves. In all circumstances, in all times of year, and in all weathers. So we need to be feeding or making available clean water from day one. And they reckon, again, it depends a little bit on hot weather and temperature, but calves need about 3 to 4 litres of water for every kilo of starter feed that they're taking. So they will drink a fair bit, and they'll drink even more in hot weather. And again, it's important that that water is clean. It's not full of saliva. It's not full of straw. And it's changed regularly so that those calves will drink plenty of it. And the more that they drink, there is, again, this direct correlation between water intake and calf starter intake. So if we can get the water bit right, then the calf starter bit will also be right as well. So if we're trying to drive intakes not only of milk in the early phase, but to try and trickle in the calf starter, and also we need to have plenty of water available to make that attractive to those calves. So key points that we need to be getting to ensure that these calves will have a total carbohydrate NFC intake of 15 kilos at weaning at around about 55 to 60 days, all being well. So a few pitfalls about where this can go wrong, and I'll give you an extreme example, which ends up with a sort of horrible looking calf bottom right, is if calves suddenly start to eat a fair amount of fermentable carbohydrate, so they're getting plenty of calf starter, and they start to eat this pretty suddenly, then they're going to produce a large amount of volatile fatty acids as a result of the fermentation that then occurs in the rumen, which will lead to a drop in rumen pH. It's an acid production, so rumen pH falls. Now, a mature animal might be able to manage that because if it's got a really good functioning rumen wall with plenty of rumen papillae, then that animal will be able to absorb the nutrients, will be able to absorb the VFAs quite effectively and get them out of that rumen environment. But a developing rumen calf won't necessarily have that. The other thing that a mature cow has is it has the capacity to do really, really good buffering of the rumen environment by the saliva, the bicarbonate in the saliva, the chewing, the saliva production in a mature animal is significant and will give good buffering capacity, which again in a younger developing ruminant is not there. So what tends to happen in these situations, or can happen, is that we get a reduced pH. We'll get some degree of acidosis where pH could easily drop towards 5 and possibly lower. And at that point also, the rumen environment is not really conducive to digesting fibre that well. The organisms that would break down plant fibre at that stage are not as functioning at that stage. So what we end up is with an acidosis situation, and we end up with an increased amount of starch passing through into the intestine and ultimately potentially out the other end of the calf, which will give you diarrhea, very often with bubbles in it as that starch ferments in the environment where it lands. So how do we manage this? And this is the key bits to managing that risk that could occur in terms of transitioning the calf around weaning. Straw or fibre availability is one thing, and it does form a small portion of the diet, 5-10% of the diet, up to that sort of level, in order to give some fibre source. The key thing practically again is that to encourage calves to eat this, it needs to be superb, excellent quality material. It needs to be palatable, attractive. Chopping it is certainly encouraging calves to take it, and it needs to be something that a calf is going to want to actually eat. It will stimulate some salivation, which will help with buffering up to a point, but not as much as a mature ruminant. And that's where we need to think about better management, about how we transition things going forwards around weaning, so that we don't get these big slugs in concentrate intake and carbohydrate intake at any particular time. So this is some of the practical points and some of the practical take-homes here for managing diet transition. So again, we're dealing with situations increasingly and quite correctly where we'll be feeding high levels of milk, greater than 8 litres per day, in the pre-wean stage before we start the weaning process. We need to be looking, I think, overall at a longer milk-fed period, so looking to head towards 9-10 weeks of milk feeding before we get to the actual point of weaning. One of the key practical implications of this is that may impact on stocking rates and space availability depending on the number of calves that are there, and that can actually practically be one of the key drivers. Obviously, the longer calves are on milk, the longer they're in the calf rearing accommodation, and that conveyor belt needs to keep moving. So it really does feed into how much space we need available for calves to allow this to occur. If we're feeding high levels of milk feeding, my real major take home here is that we need a very gradual weaning that could be 3 to 4 weeks long, in order to gradually step down the amount of milk that's consumed, whilst making sure that the starter feed intake is available ad libitum, so that we're not impacting on the intakes there. So long weaning periods are really, really important. And I think the way to do this is maybe to make a reduction in milk feeding. Let's say drop it down to 25%. Don't dilute it. Don't change the milk composition in any way. Just drop the volume and then hold it. If we're going to take away 25% of the milk, we need to then allow that calf time to adapt to that change, and give it, in my view, a week or so to allow it to adapt to that change before we drop it again, and then drop it down another 25-30%, and then hold it so that calf adapts again. And you can easily see why, to really make this process work well, to drop out the milk and to increase the starter feed intake, then that's going to take 3 to 4 weeks to do. Eventually we might get to the point where we're feeding once a day, and just a practical point is that might be best done in the evening when calves are then fuller overnight, and then during the day where it's light and there's more going on, they may be more stimulated to eat calf starter during the day. And again, this next bullet point is not absolutely set in stone. It depends a little bit on the size of the calf and the starter that's being fed, but the real trigger for when you actually take the milk away is that calf, or on a group basis, that calf is around about 10 weeks old and is eating 2.5 to 3 kilos, I would say, certainly in excess of 2.5 kilos of a starter mix for 3 consecutive days. So we're not weaning by age. The age is just a guide. What we're doing is that we're weaning by the amount of starter intake, which will correlate back to the NFC intake as well. A few other points in there: if we keep calves in pairs or in groups, then that stimulates their solid food intake. It increases their solid food intake more quickly, which is a great news story. It's good for animal welfare, and it is good for increasing feed intakes. It's a learned behavior, and they learn from each other. So having a pal in there really makes a difference. My other suggestions are: don't move them as you wean them. That's another stressor on them. So what we want to do is take that milk away eventually, but leave them where they are so we're not stressing them anymore. Although I do accept entirely that group sizes, age ranges, and space allowance do very much have a practical day-to-day impact on that as well that we need to consider. Just a few points on transitioning to grass, and this relates perhaps more to spring calving systems, and how you very quickly get calves out to grass and to transition not onto a straw-based feed or a hay or a silage-based feed ultimately, but to graze grass. And I thought I would just give this example really of one particular farmer as how he does it. This is a spring block calving system. They are on calf milk replacer up to 1 kilo of milk solids to start off with. They're offered ad-lib cake, 18% crude protein cake. They're offered ad-lib chopped straw to increase fibre intakes as well. And then around about the 5-week mark, 5 week plus, then they go down to once a day milk feeding, 500 grams of calf milk replacer at that point. So quite an abrupt drop at that point. And then they'll be turned out, depending on the weather slightly, at somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks of age, usually late March, and usually on a dry day, if possible, if that is there. And that's where there's a bit of variation in turnout date. At that turnout point, they're still on milk, plus the ad-lib cake, so that 2 key components of the diet stay the same. And the initial grass that they go out to is quite stemmy, but very quickly they move on to aftermaths after the first cut silage. So the picture on the right was aftermaths after a very early cut of first cut silage. This was very, very early May, after a late April first cut silage. The farmer's comment is he wants them to go out to grass before the rumen is fully developed, and therefore the inclusion of grass in that development process, basically, because that's what they're going out to do. And their feeling is that if they fully transition the rumens onto, let's say, straw and concentrate and then turn them out to grass, they don't do as well. And that's his experience. And again, I would emphasize that grazing is a learned behavior. So they need nutritional support by way of the concentrates and the milk in this case, whilst they are out in the initial stage, because they need to learn how to graze, and that can take a period of weeks certainly for them to do that. One of the things that can go wrong in this scenario, and this, I'm not going to read all this out, but this is a couple of case reports lifted from the veterinary record, which talks about a condition called summer scour syndrome. And to really paraphrase this, these calves present with diarrhea and rapid body condition score loss immediately after turnout. And The thinking and the theory with this is it's related to a failure for them to adapt to the grass-fed diet when they first go out. They're on a concentrate and starch and straw-based ration inside, and then they are chucked out onto lush grass, and that causes a major upset in rumen flora, and they fail to cope. There may be other impacts of disease as well. I'm going to move on to a couple of those in a second. So coccidiosis potentially has a part to play, as does rumen acidosis. But it very much is usually the abrupt change onto grass that can do this. And that's why transitioning onto grass, as I've already outlined, is really, really important. There is also a thought that if they go out to really, really lush grass to start off with perhaps high protein levels, high crude protein levels, and low fibre levels in early spring, then that can also have an effect, which is why in that practical example I cited, the farmer tends to get them out initially onto more stemmy material, but very, very quickly moving on to lusher grass as they adapt over time. So just want to pick out a couple of key diseases that we need to be very much aware of at this transition to weaning stage. And one is coccidiosis, which is increasingly common in dairy systems. It can be seen both inside, if we keep our calves inside, and outside. The picture top right is showing the clinical signs of diarrhea and ill thrift, sometimes straining to pass feces, sometimes with slightly bloody diarrhea as well. And we do definitely recognize the situation where we can get acute disease with severe illness, but also a chronic phase to this, where you've got chronic gut damage and ill thrift as a result. The parasites themselves, the protozoal parasites, by and large, have a 3-week life cycle, but there is one particular species that is actually slightly shorter than that, and I'll come on to that in a second. And the way I would view this, however, is that this parasite is omnipresent in the calves environment. It will be present in the housed environment, and it will be present outside. So it's never a question of this disease is there or it's absent, and it is not something that we can get rid of. It's something like most parasite diseases that we have to manage. Like most parasite diseases, we've got an oro-fecal transmission, so it's being passed out in feces and it's being picked up by the oral route. And we need, to some degree, to allow our calves to live with this, to develop an immunity to it, and to do that usually around about the same time as we're weaning them. So there is a potential risk here in that we need to avoid them getting severe disease. We want them really to develop no disease whatsoever, to have a very slight and gradual exposure to the parasites so that they build up their immunity over time, because they do need to be exposed to develop that immunity and build that over time. So clearly hygiene and disinfection is important. We want to limit the challenge in the environment, and usually when we get outbreaks of coccidiosis is where that challenge has become too high and has exceeded the ability of the calves to cope. So fecal contamination of bedding, of water troughs, of feed troughs will exacerbate this at times, and that's yet another reason why, if we're going to feed straw, we need to not rely on calves to get that from the bedding, but need to feed it in some way other than that, in racks or in troughs as part of a mixed ration. So we need to reduce the levels of fecal contamination and slowly allow exposure to occur in a managed way. We can use treatments, and there are various drugs that are available which will work, and really we need to use those in a pretty careful and planned way, in that first and foremost they only work if there's something there for them to work on. If there's no infection at a particular stage, then there will be no need to treat, and there will be no advantage to treating. So there needs to be some protozoal parasites there to actually treat and kill. Also, there's no persistent real effects of these treatments, so they don't last for any persistent period of time. So if we're going to use a treatment, we need to firstly know that it's necessary, and also target it at a time of best effect. And really all I would see those treatments is an opportunity to dampen down the challenge at a high risk time, to really just make sure that those calves get a trickle exposure, but manage to cope well with that. So on the grazed calf side of things, I think there's a couple of things just to mention. There's a particular type of coccidia. The species is called Eimeria alabamensis, and this one has a very short life cycle and usually presents with scour when these calves go outside. Within a week or 10 days of them going outside, they'll scour quite markedly, and that's one to watch out for, which is caused by this particular strain of coccidia that acts quite quickly. The other thing to say there as well is that if the pasture is contaminated from last year, it will be contaminated for the following year and subsequent years as well, because the organisms survive quite nicely in the pasture. And on that point as well, I've blatantly cribbed the image at the bottom, which actually relates more to worm larvae, but equally it relates to coccidial oocysts as well, in that the majority of the challenge with coccidial oocysts, if we're talking about grazed grass, will come at the very low down level. The majority of the oocysts will sit in that bottom layer where the grass is emerging from the soil, and far fewer of them will be taken up higher in the plant. So if we're grazing cattle, then if we graze covers that are slightly higher, then they're going to hoover up less parasites. Now that suits the style of how calves graze. Obviously, there's a balance to be struck there as well, in that if we graze really, really high covers, then the nutritional quality of that grass might be slightly lower. But there are ways of meeting a happy medium there, whereby we still have good nutritional quality grass going in front of them. And then we also reduce the parasite challenge simply by grazing it slightly longer, above the 5 to 10 centimetre mark. The final disease challenge that I just want to mention before I finish is respiratory disease. And I come back to this slide just talking about all the stresses that some of which I've mentioned and some of which I haven't in detail in this talk, but all the stresses that we subject these calves to in early life. It's quite a stressful period for them, and weaning is part of that. And the reason for mentioning that really is that stress equals cortisol release. Cortisol is one of the stress hormones that circulates around the body, and the higher your blood cortisol level, if you're a calf, or indeed if you're a human, then that has an effect on your immune response. So the immune response, the cellular response, and indeed the non-cellular response is compromised with high levels of stress hormones. And it is that stress very often that is a trigger for respiratory disease. So hopefully in the talk, I've already highlighted some of the ways that we can mitigate that. And don't worry, at this stage of the evening, I'm not going to spend hours talking about respiratory disease. And my main take homes are actually fairly simple, in that I tend to work on the assumption that most calf rearing enterprises have most disease pathogens when it comes to respiratory disease. We can eradicate a few, but the vast majority will be there. And certainly if we're dealing with dairy beef systems where we're mixing calves and transporting them, then I would assume that all pathogens are there at some stage in the process. It's always a viral start, and then very quickly the disease presentations that we see are a bacterial bronchopneumonia. It's a bacterial disease that makes these calves ill or ill-thriven. We definitely have issues with chronic cases, and we definitely have these concerns with calves that develop pneumonia fairly early on in life if things don't go well for them. And we definitely have issues with these chronic cases reactivating, sometimes with a massive release of inflammatory mediators like the picture below, which can be very often triggered by a stress response. Weaning equals a potential stressor, and if we can reduce that stressor through managing some of the points that I've mentioned about weaning stress and some of the other stresses as well, and then we can reduce the respiratory pathogen challenge through reduced mixing, then we can make a difference. The other thing which goes without saying is that weaning is always going to be a higher stress period for calves. We want to mitigate that stress as much as possible, but it also coincides where colostral immunity is waning, and some of the early vaccinal immunity from the intranasal vaccines that calves might have received is also waning. So we need to think about ensuring that vaccinal levels for whatever diseases we're talking about are boosted ahead of weaning so that that calf has the best chance. So my concluding comments, and thanks for sticking with this. Firstly, know your target mature cow weight. Where are we heading for with all of this? How many of your first calving heifers make it to second lactation and third lactation? It's a challenging metric for any dairy farm, but it's one that is really worth keeping tabs on and striving to increase as much as you can. It's starch that drives rumen development. That's the thing that drives it, and we need to get those levels just right. Too much starch potentially in short periods of time will lead to acidosis. Too little, and we'll have too little rumen development. So we've got to get that bit right. Take longer over weaning. I think this is really important in that we need to be looking at 3 to 4 weeks to wean a calf and allowing that time for really effective weaning. The only thing that should change at weaning is the milk should stop. Everything else ideally should occur out with that window. So we're reducing the number of things that we do to that calf at that point. When we get calves out to grass, grazing is a learned behavior. So we need to allow time for calves to do that. They adapt very quickly, but we need to support their nutrition through that. And they can do that really effectively. Work to build coccidial immunity. Don't over rely on treatments, and that if we can keep the hygiene right and we can manage exposure to a low level, then they'll build immunity really nicely for the longer term. And all of what we've been saying is about minimizing stressors to reduce the respiratory disease risk. So with that, I'll finish. Thanks very much for your time. And if there's any questions, we'll quite happily chat away.
Thank you so much, Colin. That was so comprehensive and so much detail and information there. People really stayed with us during the webinar. We have had one question actually quite early on in your presentation from Beth Riley, and she asked if we go back to remembering, I think it was either slide 3 or slide 4. And she asks, do the growth curve targets differ between systems, e.g. our New Zealand style crossbreds, particularly as NASEM is US based?
It's a fair point, and it's just a guide, and it's a useful guide. And the way I would look at that is, and how I tend to use it as well, is where's our target mature weight, which is the point that I emphasized, is, we can put that in depending on the sort of cow that we're looking for. So are we looking for a 500 kilo cow, a 750 kilo cow? And it gives us something to go for there in terms of how that might change over time.
I've got a few questions for you myself, Colin, if you would indulge me. So I was intrigued because you've obviously given us a sort of best practices playbook there, but I wonder, in your experience as a vet and a vet consultant for Ruminant Revival, what practices do you most see still going on that get in the way of successful weaning and transition? What would you, if you had to pick a few, what would you say they are?
So I think, a lot of people are doing a lot of things right. So increasingly now, people are feeding concentrates right from day one, and also feeding water right from day one, which is good. Where sometimes that doesn't go quite so right is that refreshed, and is that really as palatable as it could be? Is that solid food quality what it needs to be in terms of making that attractive to that calf? At the end of the day, if you give that calf a choice at that stage, it's going to want to drink milk because that's what it likes, and therefore you've got to make the alternatives attractive. They're inquisitive animals, but you've got to make the alternatives look attractive. So really focusing on that one and making sure that what we're enticing them to eat is changed regularly and is good, really, really important. I think practically one of the real challenges, and I did allude to it, is around space for calves, in that I've outlined what I would love to see, which is that we feed high levels of milk to start off with. We feed them for longer, and then we take a much longer time over weaning. So we're looking at having that calf in its calf rearing accommodation for well, in excess of 10 weeks, let's put it that way. It could be 12 weeks, it could be 16 weeks, depending on the system. And that would be the ideal, and that you really take your time over it. And I think calves respond really, really well to that. Where the challenge comes is if you're taking up all this space with 10 to 15 week old calves, and you've got a load of week old calves coming through because you've got lots of cows calving, you need somewhere to put them. And that's where people, I think, need to think much more long term about this. I mean, today, right now, you've got what you've got. You've got the space that you've got. But longer term, if we're really trying to optimize this, and we're thinking about other options, then having enough space to allow calves to be in there for that length of time, and also, you know, managing the different groupings, and also allowing an opportunity to rest a pen once calves leave, to clean it out, to make it ready for the next one. So space is a big challenge in the real world.
Okay, we've had a slightly different question coming in about feed, and this is a question that came in via email. Colin, is your preference coarse mix or pellets as a calf starter?
Yeah. So I think my preference personally would be pellets, because it's much more standardized, and it is also they can't salt it in any way. Some of the coarse mixes, it depends on the quality of them, and it depends on the variation within them, but they can pick and choose, and they will pick and choose what they like. You know, there can be all sorts of things in there, and they'll select things. So I would prefer, in a way, that they take a pelleted feed that is standardized and it's uniform. So one pellet should be exactly the same as the other pellet, and therefore, what we're giving them is a standardized thing. Molasses is an interesting one as well, because, you know, as a person, you always love the smell of molasses, and it looks good, and it's nice and sticky, and it looks good, and you tend to think, or I tended to think, that that's quite attractive to calves, and that they would, you know, lick the treacle almost, if you see what I'm saying. But it doesn't always work like that, in that it actually sometimes reduces intakes if it's very, very heavily molassed as well. It provides sugar for sure, but it's one of these things. It somehow looks good to the person, but doesn't always work as well for the calf. So, for my money, I would go for pelleted starter feed, and then it's standardized, and then you know what exactly, you know, if they're eating a certain weight, you know exactly what they're getting.
Just going back to transitioning to grass, and this might have been in the talk and I missed it, so apologies if I did. And I know you talked a lot about the different diseases that animals can be prone to if they're turned out too early. So what if a group has been turned out too early? What is the greatest indicator of that? What would you observe?
I mean, it all depends how they're transitioned, doesn't it? But if they're out to grass without a good transition to that grass, then it's going to be a real challenge to that rumen. In that, if you imagine, if you're a calf and you're inside eating chopped straw and a concentrate feed and maybe a small amount of milk, and then suddenly you're out the door with no transition whatsoever, and the straw feed is stopped, the concentrate feed is reduced right down, the milk is stopped, and you're then on that grass, then that's going to be a real challenge to you. You know, it's a massive change in everything. And the other thing is that calves don't really know what grass is when they first go out there. They'll run around the field, they'll play with it, they'll chew it a bit, they'll pick at the leaves to start off with, but it does take a little bit of while, you know, whether that's weeks or days, to learn how to graze properly and graze effectively. And once they've cracked it, then they're romping on really, really, really well. But it does take a little bit of a while. So they would scour, that sort of summer scour syndrome that's talked about, they can be really, really ill, really, really dehydrated. In the worst scenarios, is life-threatening. And the only real option to manage that is almost to sort of bring them back inside and to put them back onto their old feeding regime and just try and stabilize things. Thankfully, I think we've got lots of pointers to avoid that occurring. And I think the most important thing, and it was highlighted in that example that I gave as just an example, is you turn them out, but you keep them on the same ration that they were on inside as well. So you're providing them with all of the different constituents that they were on when they were inside, and then they can choose. And then they slowly work out what grass is, and they slowly work out where to go from there. So that's the important bit. If you think about a suckle calf at grass, again, if you link back to that one, the way they learn to graze is they copy their mothers at the end of the day. They're sucking away on their mums for the first, almost exclusively for the first few weeks, but they watch their mums graze and they very quickly do the same. So they start to pick away at small amounts of grass very, very early on. And that's nature's way of doing it, if you like. We've got to help these dairy bred calves transition onto that as best we can. I know some farmers say is actually having a more mature animal in there just so they can copy it. It's not a bad idea either.
I'm going to ask one final question, and I suppose it's partly related to that, but also you've been writing a lot about heat stress recently, and just returning to the points you were making about infrastructure and the need for, investment in buildings, in housing. If you're going to do these longer periods inside, then you have to have somewhere to put the calves. If farms are having to look at both, managing their infrastructure for heat stress and also these longer weaning periods for where does the investment go first? Because it's not insubstantial, is it?
No, and right now with milk price as it is, then there are genuine financial sustainability challenges on the industry right now. So investment will always, on most dairy farms, go to the cows because they're the ones that make the money. So people will always go there to start off with. And I don't think that's necessarily incorrect. Although longer term, bigger picture, as hopefully milk prices stabilize, go up, then it is the calves that are the really good dairy farmers out there, and there are many of them. They know full well that the calves are the future of their herd, and that's what they need to focus on. And that relates back to some of those figures of around age at first calving and all the rest of it that I mentioned at the start. So really focusing on that is really, really important. A really interesting one, which I didn't mention actually, is, and it actually relates back to your heat stress in your late pregnant dairy cow. But if that dairy cow is not eating as much in late pregnancy because she's not having a good time, because she's been hot over these few weeks, there's actually a direct correlation between beta hydroxybutyrate levels, which is a lot of the vets and farmers on the line will know what that is in terms of it's a marker for energy deficiency in a late dry cow or an early lactation cow. But if your BOHB, beta hydroxybutyrate levels are high, as a cow, the calf that you give birth to will have a slower rumen development. It's really bizarre. It's funny how these things all start to link up, isn't it? But there has been a direct correlation shown between cows that are under pressure energy wise in late pregnancy and how well that calf's rumen develops, in the weeks and months that then follow. So it all links up. And in an ideal world, you want both, but without question, it's going to go to the cows first in the real world.
I'm going to squeeze one more in, Colin. That's fascinating. And then a topic for another webinar. Holly has put a last minute question in. How slowly should the feed be reduced once they're on grass, or will they self-wean? And we've only got 60 seconds for your...
The latter, really, I think, in that you'll know, certainly in my experience, you need to support with concentrate for a longer period of time because ultimately it's that drives the rumen papillae development. Again, we've got to provide the concentrate and we've got to provide the carbohydrate in that way. If you're providing hay or straw or whatever, then they'll tend to self-wean quite quickly. But I think you have to keep the concentrate period going for a long period of time. And it also evens out the vagaries of the Great British weather that occur. If we've got calves out at grass in late spring, early summer, we have some glorious weather and some not so glorious weather at the same time, don't we? So yeah, the concentrate is a period of months, certainly.
Good points, and thank you, Colin. Well, that's kind of all we've got time for today, actually. An hour well spent, I would say. So thank you to Colin and to all of the audience for joining us. And if you're not already, please, if you're on LinkedIn, follow us on LinkedIn. And if you're not on LinkedIn, join the mailing list through the website, which is ruminantrevival.co.uk, and you can sign up for our newsletter there. And we're going to have more webinars and events and lots of content coming soon. So we hope you engage with us and come along to more of our events. But until then, have a fantastic week ahead. Hope the sun keeps shining, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.